for coming today. We are recording this event, but obviously the attendees are not on camera, so that hopefully that's fine. I'm Lela Kogbara. I'm a director of Black Thrive Global, and I also work in Lambeth, and I'll be chairing this event today. So if we move on then, just quickly to run through what we plan to do today, starting off with this welcoming introductions for the panel. We'll do housekeeping first, talk about Black Thrive, introduce the panel, and they will do presentations, which will be between 15 and 25 minutes in total of presentations. And then we will have a discussion amongst the panel with some questions. And then there's an opportunity for questions and answers from you, the audience. And please feel free to post questions in the question function that you have at any point in the discussion. So you don't have to wait till all the panel members are done. Yeah, as I said, we're recording this. Please, can you make sure that you are muted, and that because we want to keep the focus on the speakers. Ask your questions to panelists via the Q&A function. Be respectful in your questions, as stated there, not discriminatory or racist, not offensive. And if anybody is any of those things, we will remove them. If you have any tech issues, you can reach out to Omalara, who's the communications manager at Black Thrive, via that email there, the marketing email of Black Thrive. If you have technical issues or anything, then that's fine. And she will do her best to address them, although tech issues aren't always possible to address. So off we go. So just for many of you will know Black Thrive, of course, but for those of you who don't, we're an organization that exists to address the inequalities that negatively impact the mental health and well-being of Black people. And a key part of how we work, which is relevant to this particular webinar, is that we place Black communities at the forefront of reimagining, redefining, and co-creating a society in which they thrive. We have two priorities, but they are rather large ones. One is embedding race equity in systems change. And so that is in changing systems across all the key things that affect the lives of people and where there are issues for Black people. So that will range from children and young people, education, criminal justice system, employment, health and social care, and so housing and so on. So that is our ambition. And the second priority is building a Black Research Institute and Observatory. And that is we've started building the foundations for that already, recognizing that Black voices are often absent from research and therefore from evidence, and that the evidence that is used for policy and practice is therefore not necessarily, part of the reason why it's not meeting the needs of Black people is because of the Black voices not being centered, the research not being looked at and data not being looked at with a specific Black lens. So those are our two little priorities. So moving on. So we've got three good, great, interesting speakers lined up for you. And they are going to speak one after another, and then we're going to have a panel discussion before opening up to questions. But as I said already, feel free to put your questions in the question and answer, using the question and answer function. So our first speaker is going to be Mitali. She's a grant maker and social justice advocate with over 10 years of experience of working in social change, through funding, research, policy, programming, and community organizing. For the past 4 years, Mitali has shaped and stewarded grant-making programs, including at Battersea Dogs and Cats Home, the National Lottery Community Fund, and the National Emergencies Trust. After Mitali, we will have Derek Bardowell, who is a writer and CEO of 10 Years Time, and also a Knowledge Equity Fellow at the Skoll Centre for Social Entrepreneurship, Side Business School, and the University of Oxford. Derek has also got a lot of experience in grant making, including at the National Lottery Community Fund. Yasmine Ibison is the Employment Programme and Partnerships Manager at Black Thrive in Lambeth, and she manages a programme of work which seeks to improve employment outcomes for Black people in Lambeth. So with that in mind, I am now going to hand over to Mitali to kick us off with her presentation.
Thank you, Laila. Hi, everyone. I'd like to thank Black Thrive for inviting me to speak on this panel. It's a real privilege to be part of this conversation. So trusts and foundations contribute £3.5 billion a year to the charitable sector. This is big money that massively shapes society and people's lives. At the most basic level, wide participation is needed in grant making for the sake of democracy. Participation enables people to exercise their agency and have ownership of the sites and spaces around them. People who experience inequality and are closest to social issues have the biggest stake in transforming the system. We know that they have the visions, wisdom, and leadership required to drive meaningful change, but we also know that money doesn't reach these groups. For example, only 5% of the biggest foundations funding goes directly into BAME communities. Marginalised communities are also not well represented in our sector, and those who are in it are undervalued and subject to harm. If we are to achieve social justice, all of this needs to change. The needle is starting to move, albeit at a slow pace. Some traditional funders are starting to open up their practices, and marginalised communities are creating their own radical initiatives. One thing I have observed, though, is that inclusive approaches are receiving far more scrutiny than traditional approaches. There is often pressure on people leading these models to deliver better solutions in order to prove their credibility. This is not fair and it's not helpful. All approaches are going to deliver some successes and some failures. We need to focus on the journey as much as the destination. The very process of including marginalised groups in decision-making is disruptive and changes the system. I want to share a few takeaways from my experiences with participatory approaches, and particularly how to do this work in meaningful rather than extractive ways. I'm just going to touch on a few of these now, but I'm sure we'll have a fuller conversation on them later. So firstly, for me, the work absolutely has to be values-driven. Values set the tone for how people behave towards each other and ensure that trust can be built between funders and the communities they're working with. The values that I think are core to this work are care, humility, reflexivity, and honesty. Secondly, we need to involve lived experience expertise in programme design and not just decision-making. Opening up participation only at the final stages of the process restricts the level of influence that people can have. Involving people every step of the way is the right thing to do, but we know that this is resource intensive, so money and time need to be allocated accordingly. Finally, we need to treat people with lived experience expertise with dignity and respect. It's crazy that in 2022 we're still having to say this, but funders need to pay people with lived experience if they're going to invite them to advise and contribute to their work. We can't expect people with lived experience to share their trauma and have to use this as currency. These are whole people with diverse experiences, ideas, and expectations. People's lived experience do not define them, and many people with lived experience expertise will also have professional and academic expertise that they should be given space to bring to the table. During my experience with participatory approaches, we paid people for their time and covered additional costs for childcare and reasonable accommodation for disabled panellists. While we aspired to involve external groups in the whole process, resource pressures outside of our control meant that we were only able to include them in the final decision-making phase. Rather than ignoring this or act as though we'd done a perfect job, we were honest and humble about the limitations and the progress still to be made. This gained us a lot of respect. We also created other opportunities for the panel to shape our wider practice. We solicited their feedback via in-depth interviews, which got us recommendations such as including trigger warnings on proposals that dealt with distressing issues and giving panels more time to review applications. We incorporated this directly into our future practice. To close out my reflections, the final point that I want to make is that community or participatory grant making is about far more than co-designing and delivering funding programs. Of course, these efforts are important, but they do not fundamentally change the DNA of funding organisations and the systems of power that operate within them. Unless and until funders do the deep work of building inclusive cultures and centre the leadership of staff from diverse backgrounds, change will not be sufficient or sustainable. At Future Foundations UK, which is a collective of people of colour working in funding, we have written about the harm that funding institutions cause their marginalised staff, and we've made explicit and actionable recommendations to address this. I would urge everyone on this meeting today to engage with the statement and please take heed of our requests. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matali. That's a great kickoff for us here. So next we're going to have, and we'll come back obviously to some of those points, and next we're going to have Derek.
Thanks, Laila, and thanks for having me here. And yeah, just to say 100% agree with everything that Matali has said. My name's Derek Bardwell. I am the CEO of 10 Years Time, and we very much advocate for a more racially just, equitable, reparative and ambitious resourcing, particularly of Black and Brown communities. We do so through philanthropy advice. I work with high net worth individuals, corporate foundations and charitable trusts to take them on a learning journey to change their grant making and resourcing, political education programs for those working in grant making at all levels, an internship program which aims to diversify the grant making sector. And we also conduct research. Recent reports we've done on climate justice and racial justice and how funders can do better, illustrations of the work that we do. Fundamentally, we believe that philanthropy as it stands as an institution, meaning charitable trusts, corporate foundations, these things are not going to save our communities. And in fact, their ability to help our communities has not been particularly great. And when I say institutional philanthropy, I talk really about the bureaucratic side of it that mediates financial wealth getting into our communities, which at this point still remains to be hierarchical, paternalistic, lacking in diversity, and where this is really problematic is largely through the fact that most of this money has been really built through the extraction and exploitation of our communities. That money's come off of our backs, and these systems are not equipped to really distribute that funding evenly. So we believe that there needs to be a real reversal of power, where resourcing needs to be done through a reparative lens, and where it needs to be, the funding needs to be centered in the innovation, expertise and practices of those on the front line of harm. Mainstream or institutional philanthropy, I always liken it to a statue, you know, like lots of the statues that you see across the UK. It's like a facade that presents good while not saying anything about what harm has been done behind the scenes in terms of that good. It doesn't say about how that wealth is preserved, and it doesn't say much around how the wealth accumulation and how money is invested fundamentally can undermine the money to good causes. As Matali pointed out, £3.5 billion goes into good causes from charitable trusts and foundations, but they only give away 5% of their wealth. So it means that these organizations, if it's 3.5 billion they're giving out, are probably worth closer to 70 billion pounds. So to me, that always feels really absurd. You know, when you turn around and you say that you care for something, could you imagine saying I care for you, or you care for someone, but you're only giving away 4% of your care? That to me is really, really absurd. So these institutions, what they say on the outside is generally 4% of what they really are and what they exist to be. I look at community grant making, when controlled by the community, as an extension of what needs to happen in mainstream funding, and the traditions of those communities that are most at harm and how they give should be really the fundamental practices that really influence the way that this 3.5 billion is distributed. When you look at what our communities, Black and brown communities, have had to do to survive and thrive in the UK, much of that giving has been built on circular models, on trust, partnership, self-determination, servicing our community, but also looking at systemic change, being creative, sacrifice, and having a culture of care. And also, let's be honest, it also gets a little bit messy too. But if you want change, things will get messy. At the moment, we know that philanthropy lacks, in terms of institution, lacks diversity. And we know that the people that are at the top there on the whole are not equipped to serve our communities as best possible. You cannot fake these principles of trust, partnership, self-determination, and a circular or regenerative model when the people that have been responsible for these extractive systems are still in charge of it. So you can talk about trust-based philanthropy as much as you want, but who's doing the trusting? You can talk about diversifying the board of your foundations, but what makes you equipped to make the decisions about the type of people that you bring onto the board? You can fund Black organizations, but are you an anti-racist funder? And if you're not an anti-racist funder, what does that say about the rest of your portfolio? So for us, we really advocate for a reversal of power. We've seen many performative actions from funders since the lynching of George Floyd, but no reversal of power. We believe that community grant making and grant making from people that are on the front line of harm is the best way for money to move differently, radically, but also where we can reverse this horrible cycle of framing our communities through the lens of pain and through fear. When we've seen it in action, we've seen it through organizations like Resourcing Racial Justice, which put money in the hands of Black and brown activists and artists to distribute funding, and the Phoenix Way Partnership, led by Ubele and other organizations, which really mobilize communities across the UK. But that's very much a small part of the amount of money that's being redistributed. And I think we absolutely need to see where these practices are mainstreamed in the future, with more people from communities in control of that wealth and resourcing.
Thank you very much, Derek. Again, quite a lot of provocations there, which we will come back to. So thanks a lot. And so the final panel speaker is Yasmine Ivison.
Thanks, Laila. Thanks as well, Derek and Matali, like some fantastic presentations to kick us off. And I think I'm going to echo a lot of what you've said. As Laila said already, my name's Yasmine and I'm the Programme and Partnerships Manager for our employment stream of work at Black Thrive Lambeth. I think I'm going to provide more of a practical case study of a grant funding, of a community grant funding programme that I've managed over the past 2 years now. I'm going to focus briefly on what we did and how, and leave some of the more kind of critical discussions, the whys and the questionings, as well as some of the real talk realities to the discussion that follows later on. I'm actually going to present some slides, and they do follow kind of a neat linear narrative, which is quite deceptive, as Derek previously mentioned, that this process can be messy, and this particular case study was a lot messier than it first appears on the screen. Lara, could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So just to kick off around the project in general, the Black Thrive Lambeth Employment Project seeks to improve employment outcomes for Black people in Lambeth with long-term health conditions. So as with all of the work at Black Thrive, as Laila previously kicked off mentioning, we want to do this by changing the systems that hold inequity and racial injustice in place. And one aspect of systems change is around power and decision making. So as part of the project, we set up a community grant fund of £300,000 that a working group of lived experience community members were tasked with distributing over 2 rounds. So a bit of information about this grant fund briefly. The £300,000, as I said, was distributed over 2 rounds of funding. The fund was open to individuals, groups, coalitions, and registered companies, charities, and they could apply for between £1,000 and £50,000. The fund, as I mentioned, was the aim of the fund was to support projects piloting new ideas to shift the dial on employment outcomes for Black people with long-term conditions in Lambeth, as well as improving the evidence base around what works for this demographic. And the fund really prioritised lived experience. We try and prioritise lived experience across all of the work that we do. So not only was our working group comprised of community members with relevant lived experience, along with the Black Thrive team, who all have some lived experience as well, but we actually, the fund itself prioritised applications from Black and or disabled individuals or organisations as well. So we try to embed lived experience throughout the whole process of this piece of work. Can I have the next slide, please? So how quickly the grant fund process worked. So this is the journey, and as I said, it looks neat and linear, but it's a lot messier, but this is the basic journey that our working group went on. So the first phase that the group went on was this exploratory phase of exploring the existing research and reflecting on their own lived experience to try and identify key systemic issues that this grant fund could or should address. The working group then met with some grant making experts in the field to gain knowledge and understanding of the processes that were involved, and also to, I guess, settle any of their fears and doubts that they had, as the process was quite daunting for quite a few members. The group then were involved with co-designing the grant parameters, the funding priorities, and the application form, along with the Black Thrive team. Finally, then, in terms of when the fund was launched, we actually hosted information sessions for prospective applicants covering the eligibility criteria, tips for applying, and systems change as a theory and practice. And I think this is really important to ensure that your fund is reaching organisations and individuals who may not have received grant funding before, and that it's as accessible as possible. And then finally, when the decision had been made, we also hosted feedback sessions for unsuccessful applicants in partnership with a local capacity building organisation, because I think as part of grant making with a racial justice lens, it's really important that applicants receive feedback so that they can continue to improve and continue to try and access more funding in the future. Next slide. So in terms of the decision-making process that the working group went on itself, they started off, Black Thrive actually first completed an initial sift of all of the applications that we received, because we received, I think, just under 100, to rule out any that didn't meet the criteria that the group had set itself. We then compiled a long list of all of the relevant applications and sent that to the working group. The working group then scored the long list. They did have the option of reading and reviewing all of the applications if they wanted to, but with recognition that this would have been a lot of work for people and very time consuming. So they actually just received the long list, and then they independently read and scored them all and identified their top three projects. On the day of the decision itself, Black Thrive chaired the working group as kind of an objective chair without giving much opinion, which allowed the community chair of the working group to actually participate in the decision-making process. The group then went through each project one by one, gave their feedback, and then at the end, they reviewed and voted on the projects that they wanted to fund. And then finally, just as I think it was Matali that mentioned the importance of involving people throughout the whole process, in terms of the interviews as part of the due diligence process for the shortlisted applicants, the working group members were invited to attend and encouraged to participate in these as well. Next slide. So this is our group, or not all, but many of our group of funded projects. In this photo, you can see Black Thrive team, funded projects and working group members themselves. So the projects that the group decided to fund, there were 13 of them in total. 10 are Black-led, 5 are led by disabled-led, and 6 are led by individuals. So I think this really contrasts with some of the portfolios of organisations or individuals that usually get funded. You can see from this quote that we really tried to centre and create a community of care for both working group members and the funded projects themselves, connected them together to allow the working group to see what their money was being spent on and who they'd funded, and really build those human relationships with each other. Just the final slide. And I think overall what we tried to do was really centre a holistic approach to funding. So in recognition of the additional labour that it takes to work from a racialized and lived experience perspective, both our working group members and the grant funded projects received access to a wellbeing fund. This was a pot of money where it was £1,000 per person that could be accessed and spent on their wellbeing, whether that be traditional wellbeing routes such as therapy, or more holistic items or services such as plants or the gym membership or whatever it may be. We also offered free capacity building support to our grantees, and also support with their data collection. And the aim of this was to try and ensure that these projects would thrive and survive beyond the life cycle of the Black Thrive funding that they'd received. And then finally, we really, as I said, tried to create and centre this community of care. The working group members were all paid. We hosted group reflective sessions all together, which allowed grantees and working group members to feed into the process and feedback and adapt as we went along, so that we were constantly trying to learn and improve on what we were doing. And as you saw in the previous photo, we also hosted socials where we tried to centre and prioritise spaces of joy and community, because we know that this work can be heavy and hard, and the last thing that we want is for it to be re-traumatising for our community members. So I'll stop there, and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Yasmine, and all the other panelists, Matali and Derek as well. Really, really helpful to get the kind of overview and insights, and then from all of you some practical examples. I'm going to start off by asking a couple of questions. So Derek, there's a question for you in the chat from Anna Shannon, which says, which asks, about being an anti-racist funder, and there are obviously organisations and companies that think they are, but could be doing much better. Is there some kind of charter or manifesto that you think would exist or could exist that would talk about this, enable funders to be anti-racist, basically?
I think there's, and thank you for the question, I think there's lots of work that's being done to get funders to do this. So the work of FFU UK, as Matali pointed out, had provided some really clear recommendations of what funders could do. And that was very measurable things. There's organizations like the Funders for Race Alliance that surround, and others who are doing work, the Race Equity Index as well, all doing really good work, but it's optional regarding whether these organizations take that up. And also, it's not just about whether you sign a charter, it's also about how you implement a lot of that work. So I always found that the most useful gauge of whether an organization was really living and breathing some of the statements that they make is to talk to Black and brown people that work in those organizations. And one of the things that I would often hear is that what's said on the tin is not necessarily how that's being experienced on the inside. So unless there is something through either the Charity Commission or something legally that gets these organizations to really become anti-racist funders or look at their investments, then you will still have a very patchy delivery of this work. But just as a starting point for me, it would be just that move to say, yes, we are funding more Black and brown groups. Great, that's really nice. But if fundamentally that's still, as I think Matali said, 5%, that's not nowhere near enough. And if fundamentally the other 95 or 55 or 40% of your funds are not being funded through an anti-racist lens, it means that that will fundamentally be undermining the 5 or 10 or 15% that you're funding. So it really needs to be done through some serious legal reform or some serious mobilization from groups to get funders to really be better with their practices.
Great, thanks, Derek. And so there's not a charter, one single charter, but a lot of places that people can actually look. Yasmine, I was going to say to you that the employment project in Lambeth was funded by Impact on Urban Health, and they provided the £300,000 pot that was distributed, and they also provided the Wellbeing Fund, not just for the grantees, but also for the Black Thrive team working on the project. Would you say that that was an example of, or is there anything, I don't want to put Impact on Urban Health on the spot, but is there anything within that that you feel could be different? So they've been a funder in terms of a good fund, in terms of supporting all of that, but is there anything about the process or anything else that you think could have spoken better to some of the issues that we're identifying?
Yeah, so it's a good question. I think the Wellbeing Fund particularly has been incredibly valuable for, I think, everyone involved in this process, and that has been really flexible in terms of how the ease at which people can access that funding and the range of things that they can access that funding for. I think my reflection in terms of the process itself has been that there was a tension between, because we were Black Thrive is delivering the fund and we are funded by someone else. I think as we were working with the working group, there was this tension between needing to hit milestones that had been set by our funder, right? And the pace at which the working group desired to move at, or that how ready they felt to give out money. And the tension between, well, us thinking, well, we need to give out the money because this project is 2 years long, and within the 2 years, you know, whether the group wants to take 5 years, we don't have that time. So whilst the fund, there was levels of flexibility, it still felt like there's a tension between the milestones that we maybe had to hit, or the pace at which we had to work, and the desire of some working group members who maybe wanted to feel like they could take some more time. And I guess the other thing that I would reflect on if we were to do this again would be, as I think Matali, maybe both of you mentioned already, is involving them right at the beginning. So I think before the outcomes of this project, and the outcomes themselves, Impact on Urban Health, have been incredibly flexible with how we get to our destination, but where we were going was kind of already preset. And I think an improvement would be to get people in before you've even submitted your bid, right? Manage those expectations that we might not get the money, but you're empowered to be involved from that very, very first stage. And I think that would be a definite better way of potentially doing it if we were to do this type of work again.
Great, thanks, Yasmine. We've got a few questions in the chat, but before we come to those, I want to explore this question of lived experience a bit more. And maybe you can kick off, Matali, with this one. So in terms of who qualifies as having lived experience, and actually, what is lived experience sufficient? What else is needed other than lived experience? And also, there's a potential challenge about the non-homogeneity of lived experience of the same groups of people. And I just wanted your thoughts on that, really.
Yeah, it's a good question, Laila. I think, as with most language, lived experience, or the terminology of lived experience, has its pros and cons. I think it's useful in providing terminology or language or a sense of identity that people with shared experiences can coalesce around and build a sense of a shared experience of oppression or harm or trauma, and that can help to build solidarity, to build a movement. And in that respect, it is helpful. of course, everybody's different. Everybody has different lived experiences. And there are always risks with using language to homogenize groups. But I don't think that's a reason not to use the language. I think that's a reason to approach it with nuance and with a sophisticated understanding of what people's experiences are. I also said in my opening remarks, we have to be careful not to label and categorize people just because somebody has lived experience of a trauma or of oppression. It does not mean that they are also not academic professionals or people with learned expertise. It's not you are either lived experience or you are not. I think one of the things that I found through my work using that language is there is another issue that not everybody who has lived experience of a particular issue and uses that for social impact work identifies in that way. They may reject that because it's not the language that they have used, it's language that's been placed on them. I think in my work, when I came across this language, it was being applied to kind of everybody who's doing social impact work from a space of kind of a grounded experience. But prior to that, I'd been working with Black-led women's rights organisations who identify themselves as by and for, by Black and brown women who have experienced violence against women for them. And when I was speaking with these organisations about that language, it was alien and they didn't identify with it. And everybody has a right to self-determination. That language cannot be pushed onto people just because somebody else has declared it the language of the day. So I think it has to be approached with nuance. Not everybody with lived experience is going to have the same politics. So we shouldn't assume that everybody is in the trenches together fighting for the same thing. So I think, as with all language, it just has to be approached with care and nuance, and we have to understand that everything is complex and not shy away from that complexity, but lean into it and do the difficult work of engaging with it meaningfully.
Great, thanks, Matali. Derek or Yasmine, do you have anything to add to this question of lived experience?
Completely agree that, so one, this is where it becomes really problematic in terms of who gets to do the trusting and who has the power to make those decisions. Because ultimately, if you're going to turn around and say, just because you're a Black and brown person, you have lived experience, then you'll end up with what we have with our so-called political leaders at the moment. And that's where it becomes really, really problematic. It's about people who gets to define it and who has the power to define it. And if you look at the models that, for example, Black Thrive have used in terms of its grant making and stuff, because of who has the power and how that is distributed and shared, then you get the nuance of how lived experience is applied. But so often in the sector where, and when I say the sector, I'm talking sort of mainstream institutionalized philanthropy, where that exists is people that are really using that in a very extractive terms. But even if they are doing that, and let's face it, mainstream takes our stuff all of the time, it's not a reason for us not to use it. Because the other thing that's really important is that even if some people might not identify with it, that's absolutely fine. We still need some of these common terms that act as mobilization points for us. And if we don't have those mobilization points, and we don't need to agree with absolutely 100% of it, but you do need those mobilization points that enables us to be able to get together with things in which are common experiences for us, as opposed to picking and pecking at each other. And too often what happens is that we get so caught up in the definitions and terminologies that we can just beat ourselves up before we've even got to the start line of protest. And we end up, fatigued and beating ourselves up before we even get to really tackle the enemy. So it's a mobilization word. It's not perfect, but it's still something that's useful to be used, as long as those that's defining it are those that are experiencing it.
Thanks, Derek. Yasmine, I don't know if you want to add anything.
Yeah, I think this question of lived experience has been something that myself and other colleagues at Black Thrive have grappled with and continue to grapple with all the time, really. And throughout this whole process has been it's been a talking point internally. I think from my point of view, what Matali highlighted, I think is really important around people who identify as having lived experience not being pigeonholed in that being the only perspective that they feel that they can bring. I think particularly for something like community grant making, there's a lived experience perspective, but then there's also a skill set that is needed to be able to distribute grants, whether that be decision making, reading and digesting information, being able to contribute, having a certain set of IT skills, there's different sets of skills. And I think one of the things that I reflect on with this project is, did we set the boundaries right for what was expected of people when they first initially started to contribute, and what we were looking for? So it wasn't solely lived experience, but it was lived experience plus these different things, some of which we may be able to teach you, but you would need to be willing to learn to be able to fully engage in the process itself. I also, I smiled quite wryly when Matali said that not everyone with lived experience shared the same politics. And particularly when you're going through a process where conflict could be inevitable in choosing different grants, how do you navigate that when things maybe perhaps feel more personal? For our project, people were deciding on grants around topics that they themselves, have been or directly affected by. So if someone disagreed with you, that could perhaps, bring up a set of different emotions. And how, as Black Thrive, were we able to hold that space and still make it still hold that for people that they could engage? I guess the other thing I would say as well, that with lived experience, people have varying degrees of comfortability with disclosing what's happened to them. With some people, disclosing that could be re-traumatizing for someone else. So I think the whole thing in practice can be quite complex. That's not to say it's not worthwhile. I 100% think it's worthwhile, but I think it has to be approached with care and consideration for the people that are involved. Because I don't think it's simple.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Yasmine, and Derek and Matali as well. So I'm going to come back in a minute to this question of trauma, but before then, I noticed that there's somebody has asked a question in the chat which is relevant, which is basically, funders may agree to have lived experience and empower them, but there's still the question of room to choose who you have. And I think that kind of speaks to some of the points that you've all made, which is, not all skin folk are kinfolk, right? Is that necessarily a bad thing, really? So the funders do choose, so the power is still with the funders, but how would you get around that? How would you get a situation where you genuinely had a mixed experience of lived experience, if you like? And certainly, I think that, so as Black Thrive, we've effectively chosen. So whoever is doing the choosing has a position of power. So that in itself is a challenge. So I can bet you that you could have the same number of Black and brown people as lived experience who would have, as we've seen actually from some of the government paperwork produced in recent times, who would produce the opposite decisions and results. Because in a way, you could argue that their lived experience, they might be Black and brown, but they have a lived experience which doesn't connect them to, say, for example, disadvantage. Or in some cases, it might be they're not connected to LGBTQ plus challenges, or disability people, the challenges of being disabled, and so on. So I'm just curious about this thing of, you're always going to have a power, asymmetry of power somewhere in this. So how do the grant funders, the funders, guard against essentially replicating and amplifying the discrimination, because you could choose the same number of Black and brown people who would have a perspective that would lead to the same results as the system already has. I don't know, whoever wants to chip in, just do.
Go on, Derek.
Yeah, what I was going to say is a couple of things. One, like if you look at institutional philanthropy, it's been running this way since the beginning of time. So my point would be that even if you have aspects of power with an organization like Black Thrive or Baobab or other Black and brown led funders, at least give those alternatives a chance over a significant period of years to see what's different. For me, it's not enough to say, here's a 2-year grant, or here's a 1-year grant, or here's a little something, where you experiment with that and you do things differently, but you're not given the runway that the current systems have had to be able to see whether you do everything different. So for me, it's around, one, there are now so many really good funds, as I said, like Black Thrive, like Baobab, like Phoenix Way. I think IMCAN have done a fund as well. There are now a multitude of really good examples that funders can get behind, resource over a long period of time. And when I say long period of time, I'm talking 20 plus years. I'm not talking 2 or 3, I'm talking 20 plus years. So those funds have the opportunity to work things out. I mean, this was, as I believe, Black Thrive's first fund, right? And you would turn around and say, and I've been doing this for an age, right? And I would say, it's progressive grant making. You know, the fact that you have a Wellbeing fund, the fact that you're doing capacity building, the fact that it was holistic, the fact that you are taking into account trauma of people and taking time. These are not standard practices in institutionalized philanthropy. You've done it once and you've still done better practice than people that have been doing it for 20, 30, 40 years. So my point would be, give Black Thrive money for 20, 30, 40, 50 years. If you're able to do this through working through the community to do it effectively, then give you and organizations like yourselves the runway to be able to cultivate that. And then 20 years time, let's put them side by side and see how the decisions are made and see what the good practices that comes out. But for me, it's like, we need an alternative. And right now, you could have said maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago, maybe there wasn't as many alternatives that are out there for funders to look like. But right now, there are so many that for them not to be picking up on it, that is a choice. That is a choice that they're making, not to be funding this work over a long period of time and these alternatives. And that is hugely problematic, because you can't turn around now and say, like everyone likes to say, there's not a pipeline for this, there's not an alternative, there's not this. No, it absolutely exists. And so for organizations not to be doing it, or funders not to be doing it, that is a choice. And that comes down to some of the ineptness of the leadership of people that are running those organizations.
Thank you, Derek. And I think that also speaks to the same point that Radhika makes in the question and answer, which is basically time as well. I'm going to move on now to this question of trauma, which has been touched on in both in the presentations and the discussion. And Mitali, I was particularly interested in your point about don't use trauma as currency. That was like, oof, wow, now that's interesting. Do you want to say a little bit more about that?
Sure. I think often with participatory approaches, or even just any approaches to bring people in a more meaningful way, whether or not they're using the language of participatory or community grant making, particularly when it comes from the institutional traditional funders, there is a practice and sometimes quite an explicit pressure on people, sometimes a very subtle, unwritten pressure and expectation on people who have trauma to bear their trauma from the moment they come in the room. It is part of doing the dance, doing the funder dance, performing, proving that you are worthy of being funded in, and playing into that idea that people who have trauma, that is all they have to bring to the table. And I think even where progressive funders or traditional funders who are trying to become more progressive, they assume that they can just overnight say, okay, we're not going to do this anymore, but don't communicate that to people. So people will still come into the room and think, I've got to bear my trauma, I've got to talk about how awful my life has been for them to take me seriously. And that is not, it's wrong to do that, but it's also wrong for funders to assume that they can just declare that they're not that type of a funder and expect that 30, 40, 50, 60 years of history in funding in this particular way is just going to flip a switch overnight. So I think funders have to, if they're going to include people meaningfully and treat them with dignity and respect, from the get-go, when someone comes in the room, you have to say explicitly and intentionally, you do not need to reveal anything you do not want to. It is not going to work against you, and give people permission to have control over what they want to share and what they don't, and what knowledge and experience and expertise they want to bring in the room. And equally, there has to be that element of intentional collective care. It's not enough to just say, okay, you don't have to bring your trauma in the room. I think it has to be more than that. The Wellbeing Fund, I think, is amazing that you guys had that in your funding program. I think it's so important. I think care has become this, we focus so much on self-care rather than our collective duty of care to one another. And that time has to be there, but also that resourcing has to be there. If you are going to work with people who have experience of trauma, bring in a trauma lens, fund people that can do meaningful healing work, make it joyful, and just make care central to the work.
Yeah, great, thank you. I don't know if either Derek or Yasmine wants to say anything more on trauma. That was really helpful. Thanks, Mitali. Anybody else have anything that you want to say about trauma in particular, or otherwise we can take a couple of questions in the chat.
Sorry.
Oh, I wasn't going to say anything about trauma specifically, but I was going to comment on the question before. But maybe Derek, if you've got something about trauma, you can go first, if that's helpful.
Yeah, the only comment I was going to make on trauma is this: I find it really interesting that the way that Black Thrive have done their modelling, but also resourcing racial justice, because they did that through a trauma-informed lens, and just how a lot of the community-based funds, in the way that they have been designed, absolutely very naturally, because of the people involved, ensure that care, healing, dignity, a lot of the words that we have said, and that Mitali and Yasmine have said, have lived and breathed through these funds. So what we often see with institutional philanthropy is we will see those words, but for staff members or people of colour applying into those funds, it's still harmful, and it's still traumatic, and it's still the pain frame in terms of trying to get money. But these funds, and where there's so much learning on this, is because they have been designed in a particular way where care is absolutely central to the success, however you want to define that. Yeah. But care seems very central to those programs.
Yeah. Yeah.
If I can go quickly, I know there's lots of questions in the chat. I would completely agree on the care thing. And I think this is really about relationships. I think relationship building is just a central aspect to this work. The question before around the power imbalance of who is effectively chosen to participate, I'm not sure what the answer may be, but I think recognizing that power imbalance from the offset, and then therefore recognizing that may be what the impact of that may be, that people may not trust you straight away. I think for Black Thrive, for us that were for myself that was facilitating this program, it wasn't that people they just trusted me straight away. It was a process of working to build trust over many months, and that we had to be as transparent as possible with our working group to say, here's our finances, even here's how, what my role is, here's some of the conversations we're having, here's our update reports, because I don't know what the solution is, but just recognizing that there is that power imbalance, and recognizing in that taking people on a journey where you may be capacity building with them, that also comes with a power imbalance that feels a bit top down. And I don't know what the solution is, but definitely it should be acknowledged that that is there as a starting point to then building trust from it. And I guess the second thing around who gets chosen and lived experience, I would say that having an agreed understanding of the problem that you're trying to solve is quite a good place to start from in terms of how you recruit people. So for us, if people didn't see employment as important to someone's recovery from long-term health, then this is not the right project for you to work on, and because that's what we're working on, right? And then what are the things that you can be flexible on, but what are some of the non-negotiables? So for us, it was intersectionality was something that we felt strongly about, but then to further complicate things, maybe not everyone understands what that term is. So from our perspective, the conversation or the question was, what is our appetite for taking people on a journey to understanding intersectionality? So at what stage do we need people to be at to participate? And I don't think there's a right or wrong answer to that, but I think it should be considered as part of the process of kind of doing this work, really.
I think that's a really interesting point, actually, about the journey, the learning, and what is the starting point, and perhaps time and different funds can allow development and learning longer than some others might. There was a question about pressure of time to get the money out of the door, which I can't find at the minute. But I will also highlight Daniel Chapman's question, a point in the chat. And Daniel is a Walcott Foundation, who are our grant giving partners. So they physically were giving out the grants and supporting us with the management. But one of the points that Daniel makes here is minimizing the chance that the process of allocating the funds causes division between people, for example. So, and that is a really important point. So it's almost like even the process, it wasn't easy. We did get there in the end, and I think didn't fall out, I think, Yasmine, but I think the idea that actually even the fact that you've got limited funds nevertheless. So the process and the allocation could in itself cause division and tension between communities. So I think, or within communities. So I think that's a really interesting point. If we just looking at a couple of the questions, if we think about the somebody's asked a straightforward question, if either you, Mitali, or Derek could answer, about where do we get the 5% figure from? I don't know if you know that straight off the top of your head in terms of what's distributed, but if not, just answer that one. And there's a question here from Dinah Cox. Is there a space for a human rights approach to balance out tensions between different interest groups, e.g. around religion and LGBTQ or women's issues and so on? So I think that's quite interesting. How, in your experiences, have you observed or handled some of those tensions that may exist? Mitali, do you want us to kick off? Just because the spotlight's on you, that's all.
Sure. So the 5% statistic is from research that the Association of Charitable Foundations does into how foundations wealth is distributed. So I can share a link to that. In terms of overcoming some of the conflict and tensions, I think rights-based approaches are just fundamental anyway. I think we should be taking a rights-based approach to our work. Rights are universal, indivisible, recognized at the kind of highest level of international governance, and provide a really important framework for our work, but also a framework for advocating and lobbying the government, because our states endorse and sign up to human rights obligations. I think that said, it's always difficult to take an intersectional lens and to build approaches that are not siloed and not competing against each other. I think it starts with the sense that, well, a scarcity and a competition, competitive approach. Funders are not putting, as Derek said at the beginning, funders are not even putting anywhere near the tiniest fraction of the resource that they have into their funding work, and that creates scarcity and competition. If funders were to put up the actual amount of money that they have to give away, it wouldn't be so competitive, and it would create an environment in which people can build solidarity and cannot be saying my issue is more important than your issue, and can make space for those people who have intersecting identities and intersecting experiences of oppression to actually define and lead on the agenda. Because once you get it right for the most marginalized person, you will inevitably get it right for everybody else. So yeah, there's the scarcity issue, there's the intersectionality of human rights. There's something else I wanted to say, but it's gone. So I'll let others come in, but if I remember what I wanted to say, I'll jump back in.
Okay, I don't know if Derek or Yasmine wants to say anything on that point, but Natali, whenever you feel you've remembered, jump in.
Again, I'm probably being really sad because I'm just agreeing all of the time, but let's, so I absolutely agree with human rights and a rights-based approach, and the issues in terms of to what degree do people understand intersectionality, and to what degree are we people putting each other into small boxes, and that people not being able to find the common and shared experiences. I can see that, but let's fundamentally go back to the question at hand, and the question at hand is, we are not resourced anywhere near to what we should be resourced. If we were getting, there's 13 or 14% of Black and minoritized ethnic people in this country, if we were getting that 14% that was distributed to Black and brown led social change, and there's but 10,000 charities that are Black and brown led, I believe, in this country and stuff, then you're talking about, I don't know, 500 million of that 3.5 billion or something like that would be coming into our communities as a starting point. And I'm not even saying that you're talking about 30%, because it should be more than that. But even if you're talking about that amount, resource allocation, let's think about that first. And let's think about, if our organizations are given the runway that plenty of these larger organizations or other organizations have been given, right, then we can start talking about these issues. But my main thing is that we are competing for minimal funds, and that does not create the conditions, and we have been historically and structurally underinvested in for years and years and years, so there's not much infrastructure. So there is a really severe need for a reparative approach that gives us the money resource, taking in mind the historical and structural issues that are at hand, that enables us to have a clear runway to be able to build the infrastructure, to make our mistakes, to be messy, to do all of the things that might not work, right, to be able to have the space to do it. Unfortunately, what happens with us is that we get these small amounts of allocated funds. We're told to achieve in 3 years after hundreds of years of historical underinvestment, and to get it right straight away, and it sets you up to fail. So for me, I always go back to the point of, how much money are we due? Take a reparative lens and give us a runway to be able to create these alternatives that can be mainstreamed or exist independently. And that's always going to be my starting point, because once you're able to do that, then that pressure around people going into boxes, or the competition, or people pulling up the ladder when they get a bit of money, some of that stuff will decrease when those conditions change.
And just, if I can just build on Derek's point, is that quickly, that feeling of we have to get it right, that was really felt within this project that was something that was felt strongly by the people that we had in our group, that there was a real there was a real fear actually that actually you say that you've got this power to give out this money, and people are scared to make what they perceive to be the wrong choice, because often in life it's a racialized experience. You have to be twice as good as everyone else to get half as much. So there is a fear that you've been given something and that you can't fail, basically. And I think my role was to try and alleviate that fear and to say that the learning itself is valuable, that there's no data out there about really what works for Black people with long-term conditions in terms of employment. So even if, you know, we fund these projects and no one gets good outcomes, we will still have learned so much. But to have that mindset when actually in every other sphere of society, the lens is on you, you're hyper visible in spaces and you have to achieve or else you're punished. I didn't anticipate, and I probably could have done, but it wasn't something that we anticipated, that emotional work of getting people to feel that they have the same opportunity to explore and to try and to test as others, because outside of that space we don't really. So I completely echo that, really. And I think what we tried to do with the group of people that were funded was also create that same space of these are pilot projects. Some of you have never received funding before. Some of you are individuals with a £3,000 grant. You know, we're not expecting you to work with 15 people and get them all their dream job and do whatever. That actually, you know what I mean? But it is something that comes with, that came with that group, that there was this real fear of getting it wrong. That was quite prevalent, really.
I think that's
Yasmine,
yeah,
I just want to, and it's that double pressure, because it's like the double pressure of having to be twice as good and not being able to make mistakes while dealing with extractive systems. So anyone that has been in those situations where you've got your funding terms or you're in an organization, so you've got all of these rules, microaggressions, and all of this stuff that's being imposed on you, and then you're trying to do double the amount of work to make sure that you know, are better than, or, you know, and still facing those glass ceilings and all of that. That in itself is traumatic. So forget the trauma that you go through in your own lives, being a person of color, navigating as well. When you enter these spaces and having to deal with that double trauma as well, that process can be traumatic. So the fact that, as I said, all of these funds, as I said, it's been really interesting knowing how Wellbeing was brought into it right from the beginning, you know, and how necessary that is to really build funds from that position of care, and how that can only really be owned, for want of a better word, by those from within the communities and those that's facilitating dialogue within those communities, be it proximate leaders or practitioners. I think is so fundamental to what the principles of grant making should be in the future.
Great, thanks all for those. I think that this point about internalized oppression in terms of fear, pressure, etc., cannot be overstated, really, in terms of how because we've all know from childhood, you've got to be twice as good, you've got to be better. That is pressure. And so we, you know, when we look at the sort of mental health and well-being, if you're living with that pressure, so the need, I think it's really interesting point about thinking about the whole process and the need to remove, or as much as possible, the pressure. Probably never totally get rid of it, because people have lived with this from birth, this pressure of, if I get this wrong, not only will I screw this program up, but potentially I screw it up for people coming after me, in terms of nobody will want to fund any Black people again to do this stuff and so on. So I think that's a really good point. We have a question as well in the questions from Michael Little, and he's asking the view on bypassing organizations and going directly to informal groups of citizens. So he talks about experimenting with giving £1,000 to 100 groups in the UK with no application process, no vetting of expenditure. That's not participation grant making particularly, but what about that idea of completely 100% trust-based approach, whereby you just put that in place. I'm interested in people's thoughts on that. And Michael, while you're there, I don't know if you are able to say who the grant funder was for that, because that's actually quite interesting in terms of what the onus might be on them. I imagine private philanthropy will have different rules to abide by, but what are people's thoughts on, like, why have all these due diligence processes at all? Why not just go straight to the citizens and let them get on with it?
I think this sounds great. My initial response, is it sounds really exciting. Is the question other examples? I don't have any other examples personally of this type of funding before. Or the only thing that sprang to mind that we were going to do but didn't actually get around to doing was an estate-based pot of funding, where we were potentially trying to go to an estate in Lambeth and say, here's a pot of funding and make something happen that would improve the life in your estate. And it was, I can't remember her surname, but a woman called Gail who does that as part of her work. And as part of the promotion, it's often that the estate decides on who gets the money, but then the person who gets the money often just decides to share it amongst all the projects who bid in the first place. So rather than me taking £10,000 for myself, I would give, each 5 projects to 2,000 each. And that spirit of community, and yeah, I think it sounds great, Michael, but I don't have an example of how it's been done before personally.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Any thoughts from Matali or Derek on that one?
I was just going to say that, a lot of the bureaucracy in grant making kind of just masks what are often very subjective decisions anyway. So the usefulness of that, which really has been designed to protect money as opposed to, really push social change to the forefront, kind of makes a mockery of what those systems, bureaucratic systems are. But I think I think this stuff happens informally anyway, in terms of people distributing through the basis of trust anyway. And it should be a more, and I think those are practices that, again, migrant communities and others have done for years and years and years, and should be, as I said, institutionalized or mainstreamed or done. As I said, you would need quite a significant reversal of power for that to be able to happen. But I've seen small pots of funding, be it Amara Spence did the Freedom Fund in Birmingham a few years ago for local Black artists, and I think the Dream Fund that Imi Kerr did as well, were just examples of more free-flowing processes and in terms of grant making. But yeah, absolutely, that would be where you would want to go to. You'd want to go to a spot, philanthropy means love of humanity, right? The original meaning. And so you would want to go to a process where you don't have the bureaucracy, but where this is part of everyone's daily practice in terms of how they operationalize, for want of a better term, philanthropy, as opposed to have it mediated by these huge undemocratic institutions.
Yeah, thank you. We've got, that kind of links a bit to the question from Mumbi in terms of this involvement in the bureaucracy of grant making versus the work that's needed to be done on the front line. And what's being asked here is there a tension between involving people with the relevant lived experience, etc., and taking them away from the crucial work that they are doing at the front line in their communities? And does that risk achieving sustainable change that we might be seeking? I don't know who wants to pick that up. Natalia, you're smiling, so you go.
I think it's a really good question. I think it depends how you look at the distribution of resources. Is that part of the frontline work? And I think people need to become involved should they want to. I think it should absolutely be about choice. I don't think funders should go and chase people and take them away from their frontline work if they would rather be on the front lines. But I do think that unless grant making or philanthropy is democratized, that frontline work is always going to be, it's going to be responsive. It's not going to have the space to be as systemic as it could be, as well-resourced, as sustainable, as inclusive. Of course, the frontline work that's being done is effective, amazing work, but it's always starved of resources, and without the resources, it cannot be something more. It cannot disrupt and overturn the existing problematic system. So I personally think that funding needs to be democratized, and I think democratizing means bringing people in. It doesn't have to be people on the front line. It can be people on the front line who want to, who don't, who straddle multiple spaces. But really, I think it's about agency and giving people the space to opt in if they want to, and not if they don't want to.
Yeah. And also there's this thing of there are probably plenty of people, so there's something about a perception of the scarcity of people, I think, that we sometimes wonder about. So not everybody has to do the same thing, as you say, in terms of choice, etc. And some people can straddle. And I wonder whether there is something here about we also shouldn't default to the usual suspects. Sometimes you stumble across people and you think, where have you been all my life? Because they are, they have what it would take to be absolutely intimately involved, leading things, but they're not presented as that. They're not the people that are normally gone to. So it feels to me as if there's something in all this question about grant giving and process and so on, in terms of what do you do about the people who wouldn't come forward because they just think, I don't know anything about this. They're not confident, I guess, yeah.
Yeah, and I think also when we always go to the usual suspects, we cause them harm as well, because they then get seen as the darlings and the funders, people of choice, and then that harms the relationships that they have with their peers and their ecosystems, and it causes, we think that we're doing great for these people, but we're not. We're fracturing the relationships that they have, because these are people who care about their communities. So it's also about actually not only how do we include people who may not otherwise be part of this, but how do we not perpetuate harm on those who we are always privileging to be part of our work?
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to move on to another question from Tamanda Walker. Thanks for a great event and all that. But the key question is to talk about the role of research in grant making. She says employment project particularly, but I'm just going to widen that to what is the role of research in grant making, and what role does it have maybe going forward? And beyond funds is a second question, slightly different. What other redistribution is required? And she points to intellectual property, IP and knowledge, etc. I could go on and on about intellectual property and the injustice. I think that's another webinar in itself. But let's start off with the research question about research, the use of research. We've got about 5 minutes more, and then we're going to wrap up. So if we could sort of speed along consciously.
I can go really quickly about this specific project. So we started out from a research base, an exploratory research base. We conducted both a systematic literature review with myself and colleagues, conducted a systematic literature review of academic papers which revealed nothing, that there's no real evidence about what works, but we also did some community-based research as well. So actually had a team of community researchers going out into Lambeth. That team was Black people themselves who were rooted in Lambeth, going out to speak to other Black people in Lambeth about employment, health, and at the time COVID as well, we included in there. So from that, it was about what do the people want, and that was supposed to complement the working group's own lived experience, because actually having a group of 10 people, which we haven't covered on, but they're never going to, those 10 people, or however many they may be, are not going to be able to represent the thousands of unemployed, unfortunately, Black people in Lambeth that are there today. So broadening the net, using research as a tool to be able to broaden the net as to what is out there already, but also what, in terms of qualitative research, what people say that they want or what they're experiencing, I think is so important, because we shouldn't overestimate what we think we know already. So yeah, I think it's a really good question. I'll leave others to comment on the redistribution and IP and knowledge.
Redistribution, IP and knowledge, yes. Research as well, if you want to comment on that.
Just really quickly on the research thing. So I think that's fundamental, but it's also around what research that you have access to, because we also know that Black and brown people have been underinvested in terms of research, in terms of leading research, in terms of how they're funded. And also we have to question a lot of those knowledge production systems in terms of the research as well. So I think that's another bit, because we also have lots of funders that will say the only thing that we're going to fund in terms of our funding priorities is service delivery, and saying that's how we're going to tackle it, and not looking at other elements that they would need to tackle in terms of addressing racial injustice, which would include research and some of those gaps there. So I think that is really fundamental. And then just in terms of resourcing, this isn't just about grant funding, this is about releasing in part of your endowment as well. This is around some of your assets that can be used. There is a whole range of things that, you know, as I said, it's only 4 or 5% that they are funding. So even if you're releasing 2% more, that or whatever, that is still another 1.7 billion that is going into this space. The assets that these funders have, there is a huge amount that they can input into building the community assets and economy of local communities that's just not being utilized at all at this particular point.
Great, thank you. Does anybody want to say anything on IP, or we'll leave that for the next webinar? Ownership and redistribution. Well, we've come to the end, really. So I'm going to give the panelists up to 30 seconds each to say anything, final thing you want to say. If there's any final thing you want to say.
Give Black Thrive huge significant amounts of money to not only just deliver and do its work, because it's amazing work, but also to be able to spread or redistribute funds in the way that it has done. It's not hard. 20-year grants, long-term, multiple amounts of money from funders. It's not hard.
Thanks for that, Derek. And I promised audience we did not pay him.
You didn't pay him. That's what I was going to say.
We did not pay him to say that.
And there are also other fantastic organizations out there who are.
Yeah, and to be honest, that's one of the things for us, is not to be the only ones. Actually, which I think is a really important point. That actually, if we could find, we'd love for, following on from this, other Black-led organizations that can do this, to do it, and we share and in various ways, rather than do it, and in different parts of the country as well. Yasmine, you were going to say something?
I was going to say quickly that the work is relational. I think the relationships form the basis of all of this work, and that takes time, effort, and it takes resource, actually, that often is overlooked, the time it takes to build relationships and trust. So I think it has been a journey that has felt messy at times and difficult at times, but it has 100% been worthwhile. So if anyone is interested, I think the best thing to do is to just start, really. Just start.
Thank you, Yasmine. And then Matali, you?
Yeah, I mean, not much to add to what's already been said, but I totally echo Yasmine. This work is about relationships, and relationships do not have quantifiable outputs. So just invest in what people need to build community, to build movements, to build solidarity. Solidarity cannot be quantifiable, but it is the basis and the foundation from which movements build and social change happens. There are divisions within and among our communities that have been caused and perpetuated by the state and by the environment in which we live. So we cannot expect to just go and fund organizations to deliver perfect projects. We have to support people to undo a lot, to unlearn a lot of that divisive, polarizing harm, and to build solidarity. And we have to invest in visions as well, in visioning exercises. A lot of people do not give themselves permission to imagine a different way because they've never had the space to. That's one thing that we found at Future Foundations when we sat down and we said, what does the future look like? We didn't know because we didn't have the tools and the permission and the space to be really imaginative and to be really creative in what we thought we could build and exist. So I think invest in giving people whatever the space is that they define and whatever tools they define are needed to just dismantle all of the horrible systems we're living in and build something completely transformative.
On that positive upbeat note, thank you so much, Matali, Derek, Yasmine. Thank you, fantastic presentations and input and responses. Thank you, dear audience. You've asked some great questions. We've not been able to answer every single one. What we will try and do following this, we can share the recording, we can share, we can also try and answer some questions. We can share some of the links to the things that we've mentioned, and we'll answer more of these. Thank you so much for your time and your contributions. And yeah, so watch this space. Change is coming. Thank you very much. And see you then. Bye.